Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, a podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. On this episode, Marshall Kosloff talks with Paul Sparrow about his book, Awakening the Spirit of America, FDR's War of Words with Charles Lindbergh, and the Battle to Save Democracy.
Paul Sparrow, welcome to Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you for having me, Marshall. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting with you too. Let's just start at the most meta level possible. So you have a career in broadcasting. I obviously have a career as a podcaster. I think this topic is so fascinating for the two of us because it's just this perfect example of how the medium of communication plays such a role in actually there being this enormous debate from the big figures like FDR and Lindbergh, but then just getting that to everyday Americans to think about this big topic of the era, that being the U.S. in the lead up to World War II. I'd love you to just sort of start there, talk about how your career and work in broadcasting relates to your interest in this topic.
So I was a storyteller. I worked as an editor and then as a producer and then as an executive producer, but I always sort of saw myself as a storyteller with a deep interest in history and American history particularly. And I find that I also worked at the museum in Washington, D.C., which is a museum dedicated to the history of journalism. And you really understand how journalism, how political communications change over time as the medium of communication changes. So if you go back and you look at Lincoln, Lincoln said that photograph of him helped him win the election because he understood the power of photography at that moment as photography was emerging as this new medium with newspapers. And then you look at Franklin Roosevelt, radio had sort of emerged on the scene in 1920 at KDKA, the first commercial radio station. And it took a while for there to be widespread use of radios because they were expensive and then the Great Depression hit. So when FDR was elected, about 30% of homes had radios. And by the time he died in 1945, 90% of homes had radios. So it really became the ubiquitous mass medium of communications. You look at John F. Kennedy, he understood the power of television. If you look at Donald Trump, he understands the power of social media. So in each era, you see these different medias emerging, and savvy politicians really understand how to use them. And I would say Franklin Roosevelt's voice and his charisma were the perfect match for the technology of radio.
So this is a fascinating time to have this conversation after the election, because in the 2016 Trump victory narrative, his mastery of social media and Twitter obviously played a large role at a narrative level, but a narrative that's emerged after the 2024 election is that Donald Trump was on all of the podcasts and Kamala Harris did not go on as many podcasts, notably the Joe Rogan Experience. And I could say as a podcaster, it was funny because the day after the election, my inbox was full of Democratic politicians pitching themselves via their comm staffs for the podcast, because now there's just this idea that this was a weakness that Kamala Harris had, whether or not it was decisive or not is a separate topic, but this is going to clearly be a thing moving forward. So this idea that different politicians are always going to constantly reimagining their approaches and their articulations, given the style of the moment, is very, very essential. So let's just start there. FDR obviously didn't have a background in radio. What do you think led to his having the ability as this very early 20th century figure who you wouldn't think inherently would have that ability? What do you think prepared him to be good at the format?
I think he was a savvy politician, and he understood that you have to reach people. When he first ran for state legislature in New York, he went and drove through the entire county that he was going to be representing and just drove around and got out of his car and talked to people face to face and say, "Hi, I'm Franklin Roosevelt. I'm running for state senate," and they would say, "Well, we don't vote for Democrats." And he'd say, "Well, why not?" And then he'd have these conversations. He engaged very much in retail politics and actually going out and meeting people and talking to them. And he understood how important that was. And he also understood that with radio, unlike newspapers at the time, with radio, you could really have an intimate experience because your listeners are sitting in their living room with a couple other family members. They're not more than 10 feet away from the radio. And he understood the power of that intimacy. I think one of the things that is remarkable is when you listen to the speeches he gives on the campaign trail, for example, or State of the Union address, where he's orating and projecting in this large space to many, many people. Very different kind of speeches than he gives when he did his fireside chats, which were much more intimate. He used much simpler language. He used a lot of visual metaphors, things people could understand. So he understood that intimacy that he could get with his audience, with the voters, through the use of radio. And he was really the first significant politician to understand that nuance and to take advantage of it.
So let's talk about the other character in the book and the other side of this great debate about American involvement in World War II, Charles Lindbergh. So obviously, Charles Lindbergh is a difficult figure to talk about because there's so much that's incredible and laudable about him. And then also, frankly, just deeply sympathetic. So obviously, he's crossing the Atlantic for the first time in the spirit of St. Louis. He's then, of course, subjected to the horrific tragedy of the kidnap and murder of his first child. And then the press, given different standards of the time, just behaves abhorrently during that period. But he's also kind of a taciturn sort of, I don't want to say difficult personality, but he's not someone who's just chasing the camera and chasing the microphone. So at a performance level, how was he as a user of communication and radio and speeches? How would you sort of evaluate his abilities in the space?
Well, Lindbergh's most effective characteristic was his authenticity. He was who he was. He wasn't trying to be somebody else. He wanted to say what he wanted to say, and he would say it. And he had this very sort of flat Midwestern accent. He usually spoke in a fairly calm, unemotional way. He was very logical. He would lay out his arguments, explain why he felt the way he did. And so he had a very sympathetic kind of presentation, which was not ego-driven, unlike most people who mastered radio. He also was a person who was extremely self-confident in his own points of view. He believed he was right. And his period when he was in sort of exile after he fled the United States because of the, as you said, the press mistreatment of he and his wife over the death of their son, when he was there, he was, in England and France and Germany and Russia. And because of who he was, all of those governments wanted him to fly their planes. Hey, come fly our plane. Tell us what you think. And he got, hands-on experience with all these different air forces and realized very quickly that the Germans were way ahead of the Americans, the British, the French, the Russians, and that their economy and that their technology was very dynamic, that this was a country on the move, and he was very impressed with their order and the effectiveness and the efficiency of that societies. And he saw particularly the French and the English as these sort of decadent, decaying empires living off their past glories and trying to deny Germany the right to expand through military force the way they had expanded their empire through military force in the 19th century. So I think you've got some very interesting characteristics that emerge with him. And so when he comes back to the United States in 1939, and then Germany invades Poland, he doesn't go on the air because he wants to make a name for himself. Again, he's still one of the most famous people in the world. He goes on the air because he really believes that Americans are being hoodwinked and that they're being fed propaganda, and that he needs to be a voice for those who don't want to get involved in this war. The isolationists, he calls them anti-interventionists. But so he's really speaking from the heart. In the beginning, he's speaking for a majority of Americans. About 70% of Americans in late 1939 did not want to support the Allies and did not want to get involved in this war. So he's speaking in an authentic voice. He understands he's reaching millions of people through the radio. He uses his celebrity to get access to the radio waves. And then he delivers a message which is very consistent and very logical and at 180-degree odds to President Franklin Roosevelt.
I think what you illustrate in the book and illustrate in your answer is that so much of this cannot be unentangled from one's personality and framework of the world. So to your point, Lindbergh has a strength in the sense that he knows who he is. He's very certain. He's plain spoken. But that really becomes a weakness as you understand during this debate, because notably part of this self-understanding is that he is not a politician. His father's a politician who had a, initially successful, but then obviously unsuccessful career at a couple of different levels. He kind of finished out his political life as a third-party gadfly. But notably, if you look at the mistakes that Lindbergh makes throughout the course of this great debate, starting from a position of strength where, to your point, 70% of the American people are on his side, but then eventually just sort of becoming untouchable. He can't rejoin the Army Air Corps. He has to sort of fly under the auspices of an adjutant to the Army Air Corps and the Navy and everything. But it's really his inability to reckon with the fact that if he's going to enter into this debate, he has to behave as a politician does. He has to not always say every single thing that he believes. He has to think about different audiences, which will really speak to this dynamic, because that seems to be the primary advantage that FDR had over him.
Well, it's very interesting that over time, he reveals more and more about his true self. And so in the beginning, like in his first radio address, and just weeks after the invasion in September of 1939, he sort of hints that there are these people who control the media, a small minority of Americans who control the media, and they are, feeding us propaganda, which is a veiled reference to the anti-Semitic trope that the Jews own the media. And of course, he had a particularly antipathy towards the media, newsreels and newspapers because of the way he had been treated. He and his wife had been treated after the death of his son. And he tended to blame the Jews for that treatment of him. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, many of his radio broadcasts, he refused to allow a newsreel crew to come in and film him. Like most people did, they would do the radio broadcast live, and then the crews would come back in and they would set up their lights, and the anchor, or FDR, for example, would repeat parts of the speech, which would then be edited into the next week's newsreels. And Lindbergh refused to do this because he felt that, as he said, the film would be cut badly because it was controlled by the Jews. And so in the beginning, he just sort of hints at this idea, but eventually by the summer of 1941, he's coming right out and saying, the three forces that are trying to drag us into the war are the British, the Roosevelt administration, and the Jews. And the Jews do it because they have an unimaginable control over the media and the government. And this is a point at which he knew going into that speech that it was going to cause problems. His wife warned him, do not say this. Take this out of your speech. He refused to take it out of the speech. And of course, it's got tremendous backlash, as you would expect. And tens of thousands of people quit the America First committee that he was the spokesman for at that point. But at the same time, thousands of pro-Nazi German sympathizers joined the America First movement. So it shifted even more from being a anti-war, anti-Roosevelt movement to being pro-German, anti-Semitic movement that really reflected some of the worst aspects of American society at that time.
I like your juxtaposition of that shifting point within the movement, because I think the best books of this period, and I think your book is included in this category, take America First, the America First Committee seriously, and don't just read them backwards through the lens of what we then know happens. Gerald Ford was a part of the American First Committee. Kingman Brewster, the future president of Yale University, sort of this pillar of the liberal establishment, was a part of America First. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. is a member of the America First Committee. At the time, speaking in 1939, I find the idea incredibly sympathetic. It's actually a reality that rhymes very much of today's moment, where we see the war in Ukraine, conflicts in the Middle East, the future of the Indo-Pacific, through the lens of the fact the American people feel deeply dissatisfied with the outcomes of the war on terror, the war in Iraq, and the war in Afghanistan. For Americans of the time, seeing another European conflict through the lens of an unsatisfactory, not just end to World War I, but then the 20s and the 30s and the debates between European powers, it's completely understandable why people were attracted to that movement. It's really then when you go over to the line that it becomes very, very complicated. So talk about your thoughts on America First from a sort of what did it speak to that's reasonable and rational to Americans at the time?
Well, you have to remember the America First movement America First Committee went through tremendous changes. It started, as you pointed out, Gerald Ford, Potter Stewart, a couple of other people who went on to have significant political careers on the campus of Yale University. It was a college movement, not unlike the 60s anti-war college movement, of people who said, we don't want to get involved in the war. America should not get involved in this war. And it was more anti-war than it was pro-German or pro-Nazi. It wasn't anti-Semitic. It was anti-violence, right? And of course, a lot of people had very bad feelings in the residue of World War I. Britain and France had not repaid their debts during the Great Depression when we needed that money. They felt that there was a lot of conspiracy theories about America being hoodwinked into joining World War I through arms dealers and international bankers, another buzzword for Jews. And so there was a lot of antipathy towards this idea of getting involved in another European war. When it starts, it really is this sort of sincere anti-war movement. But the students very quickly realize they don't have the clout or the organizing power to do what they do. And that's when they bring in Robert Wood, who was at that point the president of Sears and Roebuck Company, was based in Chicago, a very, very powerful corporate titan. And he then immediately starts bringing in the like-minded people who weren't just anti-war, but they were pro-German and they were pro-Nazi and they were pro-Hitler. And in many cases, they were virulently anti-Semitic, like Henry Ford, for example, William Randolph Hearst, Colonel Robert McCormick in Chicago with WGN. So the organization shifted over time and became increasingly pro-German, not just anti-intervention. It's a complicated dynamic to fully understand because Americans weren't particularly sophisticated in their understanding of global politics. And a lot of newspapers were very partisan back then. The media was very partisan. So you had these large media empires, the Hearst Empire and McCormick Empire and McCormick's sisters and cousins who owned the Washington Post and the New York papers. So there was a coalition. You could almost think of them like a Rupert Murdoch sort of media empires that were supporting this pro-German, anti-British movement. And then you also had millions of Americans who were pro-Nazi. They filled Madison Square Garden. I mean, they were not just the American Bund, but there were a number of, fascist neo-Nazi groups within this country who really believed democracy is dead. If Lindbergh's own wife wrote a book in the summer of 1940, she was an accomplished author, very well respected, and she wrote this short book because her husband had come under so much attack for his position, and she called it The Wave of the Future. And in this book, she comes right out and says, totalitarianism is the wave of the future. Democracy is the wave of the past. Fascism and Hitlerism is just the scum on the surface of the waves, and we have to accept that there's a new wave of government coming in, and it's totalitarian, and we need to accept that. And of course, that was not well received.
Yeah, and I'd like for you to talk about that pro-totalitarian, pro-fascist instinct, because when you read about figures of the period, it's really fascinating. So obviously, everyone will say retrospectively things like, we didn't realize how bad it was for the Jews in Germany. We didn't get the sheer context and nature of Hitler's ambitions. And I think what makes FDR, frankly, in my opinion, the statesman of the 20th century, is that he understands these things from the start and doesn't need to just wait until 39, 40, 41 to understand what's actually going on there. But critically, and this is, I think, what is truly the most damning feature, if you look at the diaries of Joseph P. Kennedy, if you look to his son, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., JFK's older brother who dies in the war, and his diaries of visiting fascist Italy and Nazi Germany and Franco's Spain, and then Lindbergh does this, they very much are enticed and are impressed by this fascistic, very superficial and retrospective, lots of talk about energy and dynamism and decadence. Like, what is it then? And you saw this happen to certain American politicians during the lead up to the war in Ukraine. So what is it about Western liberalism that has this, that seemingly has this vulnerability that causes folks to think that authoritarianism is just stronger and better and more dynamic and more virile even?
So you have to understand the context of the Great Depression. So, from 1929 to 1939, for that decade, democracy was broken. America was broken, right? I mean, it was catastrophic. People today just really don't understand, the level of desperation that swept across America. Unemployment, the official unemployment rate when FDR became president was 25%. But of course, most households, only one person worked. It wasn't like you had, the husband lost his job, but the wife was still working. No. And there were 6 million homeless people. Now, the population then was only about 130, 140 million people. Today, we have a population of 350 million people, and the best estimates are that we have between 600,000 and 700,000 homeless people. So think about that. At less than half the population, 10 times the number of people who are living on the street. There was no government subsidies. There was no Social Security. There was nothing to help these people. They literally lived in cardboard shacks in public parks begging for food. So the sense that democracy and capitalism had failed was visceral for these people. And then they looked at Germany and they looked at Italy and they saw that their economies were booming and people were working and people were being fed. And that seemed like, wow, maybe the strongman image, and America's always had a thing about strongman leadership, maybe a strongman leader, an authoritarian leader is what we need to be able to compete with these other countries. The idea that Americans didn't know what was really going on in Germany, by 1939, by 1940, the news had reported everything that you needed to know about the creation of the concentration camps, the Jews losing all their property, them being beaten, the Nuremberg laws had been in effect for 5 years. So they knew. And certainly by 1942, the early reports of the mass murders of Jews were being reported in the newspapers, and people did know. And I was shocked when I saw this. In 1942, there was a Gallup poll that said that Jews were a greater threat to the United States than Nazi Germany. But 60% of the public pool felt that meaning Jewish refugees coming into this country, were a greater threat to America than Nazi Germany. So that gives you some basis for understanding, number one, why Americans were attracted to this idea of authoritarianism and the deep-rooted anti-Semitism in this country at the time.
I think you pointed out that Lindbergh overreaches rhetorically with the invocation of Jews and the conspiracies about control of the media. But even before he went that far and revealed too much, it seems to me the critical mistake he made from the perspective of can this movement win, is he demanded that folks truly, FDR has this great quote, he pointed this at the beginning of the book, where he says, we are neutral in our actions. I can't overwrite the Neutrality Acts. I can't reinstate the draft, but I can't ask that you be neutral in your thoughts. Obviously, looking at the Europe of 1938, 39, 1940, it was the authoritarian powers that were on the march, that were the aggressors, that were violating the status quo. Yet Lindbergh just insisted on maintaining the idea that these were just truly just these two warring, undifferentiated things. It's all one big colonial, territorial, European chaos we left behind in the New World. What was going on there? Because it just seems that like that just seems to be, obviously all the anti-Semitism is a line crosser, but the neutrality idea goes even before that too, in terms of this actual debate, which was ultimately unsustainable given what the Nazis were actually doing. So just talk to this.
Sure, because I think there's a very interesting moment in January and March of 1941. So FDR gets reelected, unprecedented third term in office. Lindbergh had campaigned hard against him, not politically, but just, keeping with his statements about isolationism. And FDR puts forward the Lend-Lease Act, which was an effort to provide weapons to England without them having to pay for it. The rule at that point had been cash and carry, and England was out of money. And at this point, the Germans had been bombing London for a year, or almost a year. The front page showed, the massacre of civilians, that showed the incredible bravery and the inspirational speeches of Winston Churchill. And so when the Lend-Lease Act goes before Congress, Lindbergh is called to testify. And during his testimony, which went on for 4 or 5 hours, he specifically asked, which side do you think would be in the best interest of the United States to prevail in this conflict? And he says, neither. And he says, I support the people of those countries, but don't think either sides would win. And the congressman is pushing them, saying, well, what do you mean? You think it would make any difference whether Germany or England wins this war? And he says, no, it would make no difference whatsoever. And he refuses to take a side. Well, now at this point, the American public is very, very aware of what Nazi Germany is doing. And what mistake that Lindbergh made at that moment was that he should have said, they have to work this out. The United States shouldn't get involved in this war. Even if Germany is the aggressor, this is not an American war. And he kept falling back on we're protected by 2 oceans. We're a big country. We should build up our own defenses. No one can ever invade us or conquer us, ignoring the fact that if, in fact, Nazis and the tripartite agreement with Japan and Italy took over the rest of the world, the United States would be an island that would have to either capitulate or deal with them. And so that's really the point where you see him losing support.
It's so fascinating. I recently recorded on a different podcast a conversation with H.W. Brands, also of the University of Texas, about his book. And I noted, because he was really focused on Lindbergh's journals. Lindbergh is obviously an incredible aviator. He's an airplane mechanic. He's designing planes. He plays a big role in World War II when it comes to actually refining the designs of American planes. So he very much does contribute to the war effort, even though he can't actively serve. But it was just so fascinating to consider that he was just so certain of his understanding of airplanes and technology without understanding just in 4 years, at a very basic level, this idea of the U.S. just being separated by oceans is just over, right? So when he's explaining why the U.S. shouldn't be threatened by Nazi Germany, he's pointing out, well, the Germans don't have a strategic bomber, which is true. They don't have a strategic bomber. It's one of their big errors during the war. They couldn't just reach New York and easily do that, but the V1 and the V2 are being developed during World War II. You have the innovations with jet aircraft. All these things are happening that completely just obliterate the idea that we're living in this quasi-19th century world where the U.S. can just be truly treated separately. And obviously, this is setting aside just the development of nuclear weapons that, all powers at the time were then proceeding, which when combined with the V1 and the V2 and its successors, is obviously something that completely changes the nature of war. So can you just speak to sort of like the technological side of this picture and how this is just shifting so rapidly that really makes the 39-40 part of the debate feel completely irrelevant, even by just midpoint in the war?
Yeah, I totally agree. And Professor Brands takes a much more sympathetic view of Lindbergh than I do. And he's much more critical of President Roosevelt than I am. And I'm an unabashed Roosevelt fan, so I'll accept that criticism directed towards me. But again, I think you point out exactly the fallacy of Lindbergh's great argument here, which is that we're safe. It's not going to affect us. And if you think about where the United States was in 1940, or let's look at September 1st, 1939, when the war really officially starts, America had less than 200 combat aircraft. The Germans had about 20,000. The United States didn't really have an advanced fighter aircraft. The Germans had 3 that were really state of the art. Americans had only 200,000 men in uniform and not enough rifles for them to even be able to drill using real rifles. They used wooden rifles. Our Navy was fairly adequate. We had a sort of a 2-ocean Navy, but it was lacking in aircraft carriers because we hadn't really understood the transition that was happening right before our eyes in the shift from battleships to aircraft carriers and the projection of aerial force. And by 1943, the United States has, or certainly by early 1944, the United States has the most advanced fighter planes in the world, the most advanced long-range bombers in the world, the most advanced submarines in the world. They have a high developed technology in radar, which is unlike anything else that's ever been developed. They condensed the size of radars from the size of a 3-story building to small enough to fit in the nose of a fighter plane. I mean, the technological transformation in those 3 or 4 years is just unbelievable. And of course, we also developed the atomic bomb while we're doing all these other things. So yeah, the technological idea around the fact that Germany was superior to us and we would never catch up is quickly disproven when, at FDR's insistence, we shift our entire industrial base from consumer-oriented to war-related, and you see these just extraordinary productivities. I mean, we go from making 1,000 airplanes a year to making 50,000 airplanes a year in 1 year. I mean, when he first comes out, with the numbers of planes and ships and tanks we're going to build, I mean, the arms manufacturers all like fall out of their chairs. The congressmen are like, we can't possibly believe that. Even his own advisors said, why did you say that, boss? We can't possibly achieve that. And in fact, in 1 year, they'd overachieved these unrealistic goals that he set. So it is a moment in American history. And I say this a lot of my talks where FDR understood that he needed to put America's industrial might on the front lines and keep our American soldiers at home for as long as he could, because he saw that public opinion was gradually shifting in his favor. But he knew if he sent American boys into action and they started coming home, in coffins too soon, that he would lose the support of the American public. And I think, the idea that he tried to provoke the Japanese into bombing Pearl Harbor is just absurd. He did not want the Japanese to get into this war. He wanted Hitler to declare war on us, which is why he kept sinking submarines in the North Atlantic. It really is an extraordinary moment in time, this period. And I think, to me, it reflects one of FDR's greatest accomplishments in not only his shifting of public opinion, but more importantly, in this preparation for getting into a war that he was saying on the surface we're not going to get into and that the American public didn't want to get into. But when we were forced into it by Pearl Harbor, they were able to throw a switch and just within a year, incredible transformation.
No, and I think leading into my final question, you just hit the nail on the head of what FDR succeeds in, which is it's easy, when Lindbergh is attempting to rejoin the army after Pearl Harbor unsuccessfully, he's asked, like, well, what about the statements you said about the U.S. and Nazism and armaments before the war? And he said, listen, this is to his credit. He says, I said what I said, I believe what I said, but we're at war now, I want to serve my country. And what really frustrates about the attempt that folks sometimes use to sort of like explicate him from those different statements is that the only reason why America then can succeed in revving up by 43, 44 were because of the moves that FDR and his cabinet and the war industry are making in 38, 39, 40, 41. You mentioned how there weren't enough rifles as broom handles. My other favorite story from this period, this is 1940 to 1941, when the Army is starting to do these massive exercises to get ready for World War II. There weren't enough tanks, so they would align a squad together to simulate a tank and walk that way. You can't just take an army of that little quality and preparedness where the officer corps and the NCOs were in their 40s and 50s, just completely not ready to actually go into a conflict, and just magically ignore all of that, act completely neutrally, and then snap your fingers in 41 when Pearl Harbor comes. So it's just frustrating that the juxtaposition isn't properly illustrated sometimes. So let's close here. Obviously, you have a relationship to FDR beyond just writing this book. Let me just close here, talk about your experiences with the library and what, frankly, his presidency means to the current moment today.
I think the most important thing to understand about Franklin Roosevelt is that words matter. He understood the power of words, and he used them incredibly effectively throughout his administration to talk to the American public, to teach them in moments of crisis. He becomes president on March 4th, 1933. His first official act as president is to close every bank in America. He calls it a bank holiday. It sounds fun, but, it was a crisis, the banking crisis. I mean, American economy, the banking system was on the verge of collapse, and people were terrified. In his inaugural address, when he says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, he's talking about the banking crisis. because people were rushing and mobbing banks and pulling all their money out. Because if a bank closed, you lost your money. There was no insurance. And so in 8 days, first 8 days, they passed this Emergency Banking Act, restructure the whole idea around we're going to classify banks. There are healthy banks. There are banks that are going to need the government's help to survive. And there are banks that we have to just write off. And we have to move forward with that understanding. And he does his first fireside chat on a Sunday night, the night before they're going to reopen these banks. And there's no way of knowing. Are millions of people are they going to storm the banks again, demanding their money? And so he gives this sort of amazing 13-minute speech in which he says, your money is safer in a reopened bank than it is under your mattress. And why was that effective? Because people had the money under their mattresses, right? They had pulled the money out of the banks. And then he explains what the banking crisis is and what they're trying to do to fix it and how they're going to move forward. And the next day, millions of people all across the country start bringing money back to the banks and redepositing in the banks. And the only thing that had fundamentally changed was Franklin Roosevelt's leadership. He was now in charge. He convinced people he was going to do something about this. And I think that reflects what America is saying right now. I mean, they're not happy with the situation we're in, despite all superficial evidence that the economy is booming. America is the most powerful country in the world. We've recovered faster from the pandemic than everybody else. Americans are unhappy, and they want somebody who's going to fix their problems. And, they see a strong man like Trump as the answer to their problems. And they don't really drill down into the nuances of what it's really going to do. They're just unhappy and they want change. And I think FDR understood that he had to channel that frustration. He had to show real progress. You think about the New Deal and all the things that he changed in the American system of government. He fundamentally rewrote how the federal government operated. And I think that was why he was a successful president. That was why he was elected 4 times, and why even today you look at his record as a president and it's extraordinary. It's every rating comes out. It's always Washington, Lincoln, and FDR are the top 3, one from each century. They did different things. FDR, in almost every speech, he references back either Washington or Lincoln or both of them, because they both were confronted with an existential threat to the American experiment. And his existential threat was from the outside. Lincoln's was from the inside. And for Washington, it was the idea of the creation of this new form of government. So I think you look at that and you say, we need leaders who can communicate with the American public, who can teach and inform the American public about what's going on, and to be honest on some levels about what we need to move forward. The next 4 years are going to be interesting. Who knows what's going to happen? And when people ask me, I always say, I am a Rooseveltian. I believe, as he believed, in the American system. It doesn't always go the way you want. The pendulum swings back and forth. But ultimately, we have to believe in the American system and let it play out, because there is no other alternative.
That is an excellent place to end. Thank you for joining me on Horns of a Dilemma.
Thank you, Marshall. Good luck.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.